Ethan Carter, a powerful white investor with the world at his fingertips, sat silently in the back of his chauffeured car, waiting for the traffic light to change on a rainy New York afternoon. As he glanced out the window, his gaze locked on a scene that made his chest tighten, a woman he hadn't seen in nearly a decade, standing on the sidewalk in the cold, holding a cardboard sign, her two young daughters clinging to her sides. It wasn't just the shock of seeing Lena Brooks again that left him breathless, it was the necklace around one of the girls' necks, the same necklace he had given Lena the day she vanished without a word. Who were these children? Why was she here like this? And what secret had been hidden all these years? The rain had been falling steadily for hours, blanketing New York City in a gray hush that dulled the edges of its usual chaos. Inside the back seat of a black SUV with tinted windows and leather interiors, Ethan Carter sat in silence, the glow of his phone screen reflecting off his tired features. His driver, Marcus, had given up on the radio, letting the low rumble of the engine and the rhythm of the wipers fill the space between them. Ethan had just left a tense board meeting on the Upper East Side, where billions had been discussed like poker chips, but none of it registered now. His thoughts were scattered, worn thin by the constant grind of acquisition talks, stock forecasts, and investors demanding more. He leaned his head against the window, hoping for a moment of nothingness, a rare vacancy in the noise that surrounded his life. Then he saw it. Through the fogged glass, blurred slightly by the raindrops trailing down the pane, Ethan caught sight of a woman standing at the corner of 86th and Lexington. She held a cardboard sign clutched to her chest, and beside her stood two little girls, huddled together beneath a thin plastic poncho. It was the kind of image New Yorkers had trained themselves to ignore, too frequent, too heartbreaking, too real. But something about the woman's posture made Ethan lean forward, the slight tilt of her head, the way she pulled the children close with one arm while keeping the sign steady with the other. It wasn't just familiarity, it was recognition. His chest tightened as the car inched closer and the woman turned her face slightly toward the street. Ethan froze. It was her, Lena Brooks, his Lena. 10 years had passed since Ethan had last seen her, but that face, now worn, tired, and lined with something that looked like quiet endurance, was unmistakable. Once full of fire and ambition, Lena had been the only woman who ever made him doubt his obsession with work. Back then, she was a rising designer with wild dreams and no patience for his boardroom lifestyle. They had fought often about priorities, time, and expectations, but her departure had still blindsided him. She had left without a word, without a forwarding address, without a trace. And now, a decade later, here she was, standing in the cold rain, holding a sign that read, "Anything helps, please." The car came to a slow stop at the light. Ethan's eyes dropped from Lena to the girls at her side. They couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. One of them had a missing glove, and her bare fingers clutched tightly at her sister's coat. But it wasn't their clothing, their posture, or even the way they leaned into Lena that struck Ethan like a punch to the gut. It was what hung around one of the girls' necks, a silver chain, simple, familiar, and on that chain, a tiny jade pendant shaped like a leaf. Ethan blinked hard. That necklace wasn't just any necklace. It was the one he had given Lena on her 25th birthday, the same day they'd had their final argument, the same day she vanished. Ethan's breath caught. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no sound came. "Everything all right, sir?" Marcus asked, catching Ethan's sudden tension through the rearview mirror. Ethan didn't answer, he couldn't. 1,000 thoughts swirled at once. Was that really the same pendant? Could those girls be Lena's daughters? His daughters? No, that didn't make sense. Lena would have told him, wouldn't she? But the resemblance didn't matter. What mattered was the weight in his gut, the tremor of something old and buried clawing its way to the surface. He reached for the door handle impulsively, his hand trembling slightly, but the light turned green, and the SUV began to roll forward. "Stop the car," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. Marcus hesitated, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Sir." Ethan's eyes stayed locked on the sidewalk behind them. I said stop the damn car now. Marcus braked hard, pulling to the curb. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt, his pulse hammering in his ears. Rain pelted the pavement as he pushed the door open and stepped out, the cold hitting him like a slap. He turned quickly, searching for the spot where Lena had been, but the sidewalk was already thinning. People moved like waves, umbrellas bobbing, feet rushing. Lena and the girls were gone. Ethan jogged down the block, scanning every figure, every sign, every corner. His shoes were soaked within seconds, and his coat clung to his frame, useless against the weather. He rounded the corner and caught a flash of the jade pendant again, bobbing slightly as the little girl moved beneath a plastic cover. There they were. Lena was moving fast, trying to avoid attention. She hadn't seen him yet. Ethan called out before he had time to think. Lena. The name came out louder than he intended. She stopped mid-step, the girls clutching at her sides. Slowly, she turned, and their eyes met across a gulf of disbelief, confusion, and something unspoken. Ethan, her voice was almost a whisper, but he heard it through the storm. It was the same voice that had once called him late at night just to hear his thoughts, the same voice that once whispered dreams of a home and a future, now coated in disbelief and worn edges. Ethan stepped forward, his hand half raised as if unsure of what to do with it. "What are you doing here?" he asked, though it was the most ridiculous question imaginable. Lena didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the girls, then back at him, something unreadable passing through her expression. "I could ask you the same," she replied softly. Her tone wasn't angry, it was tired. "Are you following me?" Ethan shook his head quickly. "No, I was in the car. I saw you through the window. I didn't even know you were here." "I didn't know," he stopped himself. He didn't know what. That she was alive, that she had kids, that she had disappeared from his life only to reappear on a street corner, begging for help in front of strangers. The truth was, he didn't know anything, and that realization hit harder than he could have prepared for. The girls looked up at him with wide, unblinking eyes. One of them, Ava, he would learn later, stepped half behind her mother's leg, peeking out with a guarded stare. The other, Zoe, tilted her head slightly, studying him. Ethan forced a smile, but it felt strange on his face, like a suit he hadn't worn in years. "Hi," he said to them gently, crouching slightly, though he had no idea why. The girls didn't answer, they simply stared. Lena's hand came down on their shoulders protectively. "We have to go," she said abruptly and started to turn. Ethan stepped forward. "Wait, please. Can we talk, just for a moment?" Lena hesitated. The rain had soaked through their coats, and the girls were shivering. She glanced around, clearly debating something internally. Finally, she sighed. "There's a diner 2 blocks down. We can talk there, but just for a few minutes. The girls need to eat." Ethan nodded, the relief so sharp it almost hurt. "Of course, let me help," he began, reaching into his pocket, but Lena shook her head quickly. "No, just walk." She adjusted the poncho over the girls and started down the sidewalk. Ethan followed in silence, questions bubbling in his throat, none of them ready to be asked yet. The clamor of the city faded behind him. As Ethan trailed closely behind Lena and the 2 little girls, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing, his designer shoes splashed through puddles, completely ruined, but he didn't care. The girls walked in silence between their mother, one of them tugging at Lena's coat every few steps, while the other kept glancing back at Ethan with a look that wasn't quite fear but definitely wasn't trust. The diner appeared ahead like a faint promise of warmth. It was small, old-fashioned, with neon lettering half burned out and fogged windows from the dough heat inside battling the chill of the rain. Lena opened the door for the girls and stepped in behind them. Ethan paused for a second on the threshold, almost unsure whether he belonged in this moment, in this place, in their lives. But then one of the girls, he didn't know which, turned around and gave him a curious look, one that seemed to say, "Well, "Are you coming or not?" That was all he needed. He stepped in, the doorbell chiming softly behind him. They took a corner booth near the back and Ethan slid into the seat across from them, his coat dripping and hair slightly disheveled. A waitress with tired eyes handed out menus and a couple of crayons for the girls without asking. She clearly knew the routine for families like this. Lena immediately began removing the girls' wet layers, revealing thin sweaters that looked like they'd been washed too many times. The girls didn't speak, they just picked up the crayons and started drawing on the back of the placemats. Ethan watched them closely, taking in every detail, how one of them sat a little straighter, her eyes darting everywhere like she was always scanning the room, while the other leaned on the table with her cheek resting on her hand, relaxed but observant. He realized he still didn't know their names, and the fact hit him like a cold wind. "They're beautiful," he said quietly, addressing Lena for the first time since they sat down. She nodded, but her eyes didn't soften. "Ava and Zoe," she said after a moment, without looking up. "They're 6. Ethan let the words sink in, doing the math in his head. 6. That would mean Lena got pregnant not long after they split, if not before. A tangle of feelings rose in his chest, none of them clear. He looked back at the girls, trying to match the names with their energy. Ava, he decided, must be the one watching him carefully while pretending not to. Zoe, the more expressive one, was now sketching a crooked smiley face and humming quietly to herself. The waitress returned to take their orders. Lena ordered for the girls, grilled cheese and fries, 2 glasses of milk, and then just coffee for herself. Ethan added a burger for himself, though he knew he wouldn't eat it. The girls went back to drawing, whispering to each other occasionally, their voices too low to catch. "They don't usually talk to strangers," Lena said, finally meeting his eyes. "Especially men." Her tone wasn't hostile, just factual, like she was laying down the rules of a very delicate balance. Ethan nodded slowly. "I'm not trying to scare them, or you," he said, leaning in just a little. I saw you, Lena, and I couldn't walk away. You disappeared for 10 years. Then I see you on a street corner with 2 little girls, wearing the necklace I gave you." She flinched slightly at that. "I need to know what happened." Lena sighed and looked away, her fingers curled around the coffee cup like it was an anchor. "What happened is life, Ethan. You always lived 10 steps ahead, always planning, always investing, always optimizing. I was never part of that equation." Her voice remained low, even, but there was no mistaking the hurt underneath. "You stopped asking about my day, stopped caring if I was at your events or not. And then one day, I stopped waiting for you to notice. So, I left." Ethan absorbed the words like blows to the chest. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but how could he? She wasn't wrong. He had buried himself in his work back then. He'd built an empire and left her outside the gates. "I would have come looking if I'd known," he started but stopped himself. Lena gave a bitter half-smile. "Known what, Ethan?" "That I was pregnant. That we had daughters. You were in Tokyo when I found out. I left 3 messages. Your assistant told me you were too busy for personal matters. After that, I stopped calling." Ethan's hands curled into fists on the table, guilt and fury mixing together. He remembered that assistant, Margaret, cold and efficient, proud of guarding his time like it was gold. He had given her permission to screen everything, it had been a point of pride back then. Now it felt like the moment he'd lost his family before he even knew he had one. Ava looked up suddenly and locked eyes with Ethan. There was something sharp in her gaze, something old for a 6-year-old. "Why are you looking at us like that?" she asked. Lena immediately turned to her. "Ava," she said gently. But Ethan raised a hand. "It's okay." He smiled softly. I'm trying to get to know you, that's all." Ava narrowed her eyes, skeptical. "Do we know you?" Zoe chimed in this time, glancing up from her drawing. "You looked sad when you saw us," she said matter-of-factly. Ethan's throat tightened. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "I guess I was." The girls stared at him for another moment before going back to their drawings. Lena said nothing, but Ethan noticed the way her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her cup. Their food arrived. The girls ate with the kind of hunger that comes from not knowing when the next meal might be. Ethan watched silently, realizing how much of their lives he had missed: birthdays, first steps, school plays, scraped knees, moments he could never get back. When they finished, Zoe looked up again. "Are you rich?" she asked, licking ketchup off her fingers. Lena froze, but Ethan chuckled. "Yeah," he said honestly. "I guess I am." Zoe tilted her head. "Does that mean you have toys?" Ava rolled her eyes at her sister, but Ethan smiled. "Not yet," he said. "But I think I'll need to get some." Lena gave him a warning glance, but it was too late. The girls were already whispering excitedly. As the check arrived, Ethan reached for his wallet, but Lena stopped him with a glance. "This isn't charity," she said quietly. "I didn't bring them here to get a handout." Ethan nodded slowly, sliding his wallet back into his pocket. "I didn't ask you here for charity, Lena," he said. "I asked because I saw the necklace and because I needed to ask you something." She didn't reply, she just waited. Ethan looked at the girls again, then met her eyes. "Are they mine?" Lena inhaled sharply, her lips parting just slightly. She didn't answer right away, but she didn't say no. And in that silence, Ethan's world shifted again. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, the city lights casting slow-moving shadows across the room. It was well past midnight, yet sleep refused to come. For the first time in years, he hadn't even touched his laptop after returning home. His assistant had texted 3 times to confirm a rescheduled investor call, and a board member had left a voicemail urging him to weigh in on a major acquisition deal in Germany, but Ethan hadn't responded. His thoughts were nowhere near stock values or quarterly growth. All he could see was the way Ava had looked at him, measuring, uncertain, and the silence that hung in the air after he asked Lena if the girls were his. She hadn't said yes, but she hadn't said no either. That sliver of ambiguity had cracked something open in Ethan's carefully controlled world. Everything he had built suddenly felt hollow, its walls echoing with questions he should have asked years ago. Morning, the tension hadn't lessened. Ethan sat at the edge of his bed, rubbing his temples, then reached for his phone. He hesitated only a moment before typing out a message: "Can we meet today? Somewhere calm, just us and the girls." He didn't expect a quick reply, but one came within minutes. Lena's tone was simple, no extra words, just a time and a place: 2 p.m., Greenstone Park, near the fountain. Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment before replying with a quiet, "Thank you." The message didn't fully convey the weight behind those 2 words. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a plea for another chance, an opportunity to rebuild something he didn't realize he'd lost until it was nearly gone. The park was one of those understated gems hidden in the city, nestled between brownstone neighborhoods and high-rises, a patch of stillness in the middle of the noise. Ethan arrived early, dressed in casual clothes for once, a gray sweater, dark jeans, and sneakers that felt unfamiliar on his feet. He kept glancing at the pathway, his heart pounding harder than it had before any board meeting or press conference. Then he saw them. Lena walked with slow, purposeful steps, her coat wrapped tight against the breeze. Ava and Zoe skipped slightly ahead, holding hands, their giggles rising above the rustling trees. Ethan stood the moment they got close, and for a second, everything seemed to pause, time stretched out like a held breath. "Hey," Ethan said gently, unsure if he should step forward or wait. Lena offered a nod, her expression neutral but not closed off. "Hey," she replied, then turned to the girls. "Why don't you 2 go look at the ducks? We'll be right here." The twins didn't need much prompting, they dashed toward the pond's edge, their energy like a spark that lit the scene. Ethan and Lena stood side by side, watching them. "They seem happy today," Ethan offered, trying to keep his voice steady. Lena nodded. "They love the park, especially Ava. She says the trees make her feel like the sky is breathing." Ethan smiled faintly, struck by the image. "She's more poetic than I ever was at that age." Lena glanced sideways at him but didn't reply. They sat on a nearby bench, the silence between them stretching but not uncomfortable. Ethan watched the girls, his hands resting on his knees. Then, as if sensing something, Ava turned around and walked slowly back toward them. Without saying a word, she stopped in front of Ethan and reached out, her small hand sliding into his. The gesture was so natural, so unguarded, that Ethan's breath caught. His fingers closed gently around hers, his heart thudding loudly in his chest. He looked at Lena, and for the first time, her eyes softened, not entirely, but enough to let something real pass between them. That tiny hand in his own unraveled every carefully stacked priority Ethan had built over the years. It was the moment he realized that no amount of success or status could match the meaning of that quiet, wordless connection. After a while, Ava trotted back to her sister, and Ethan turned to Lena, still shaken. "I want to know, not just for me, but for them. I want to do a DNA test," he said carefully, watching her face. Lena didn't react immediately. She looked down at her hands, her thumbs fidgeting slightly. "Why?" she asked, not in anger, but with quiet clarity. "Because you want the truth, or because you want to erase the possibility that you feel something real for them?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "It's not like that." Lena raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it?" she asked. "You've spent your life needing certainty, Ethan, contracts, signatures, margins. What happens when it's not numbers? When it's just feelings, messy and fragile?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I want to be sure because I don't want to doubt them or you. I want to commit fully, and for that, I need truth." Lena held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she stood. "Then do it. But do it knowing that no paper will tell you how to love them. That's something you'll have to figure out one day at a time." Ethan rose slowly, nodding. "I understand." They walked in silence to where the girls were tossing breadcrumbs into the water. Zoe looked up, her face flushed with excitement. "There's a turtle. It came out from under the rock." Ava pointed too, jumping in place. Ethan knelt beside them, smiling as if nothing else in the world mattered, but inside, he was still processing Lena's words. A DNA test would give him biological clarity, but it wouldn't teach him how to be a father. Later that evening, after saying goodbye, Ethan sat at his kitchen counter with a test kit in front of him, one of those discreet ones delivered by courier. He stared at it for a long time, thinking about what Lena had said. His fingers hovered over the box before finally opening it. It wasn't just about confirmation anymore, it was about responsibility, about rising to meet a truth that had waited 6 years to be acknowledged. And whether or not the science confirmed it, Ethan knew one thing already: he didn't want to walk away from Ava and Zoe. Not now, not ever. The morning after the park visit began like any other for Ethan Carter, the soft buzz of his alarm at 6 a.m., the slow stretch beneath high thread count sheets, and the quiet shuffle to the kitchen for his meticulously brewed black coffee. But everything after that felt foreign. His mind wasn't preoccupied with the pending merger in Singapore or the tech startup his firm was quietly absorbing in Atlanta. Instead, it hovered in a space somewhere between the cautious warmth of Ava's small hand in his and the cool, measured words Lena had left him with the night before. That fragile, unspoken shift in his priorities hadn't gone unnoticed, especially not by the one man who had helped build the empire Ethan now struggled to care about. David Blake, his business partner, co-founder, and closest confidant, noticed it the moment he walked into the office. David was already pacing in Ethan's office by the time he arrived, his navy blazer draped over one arm and a file tucked beneath the other. You missed the advisory call with Mercer, he said without looking up. They're waiting on final numbers, and you were the only one who hadn't signed off. Ethan set his coffee down. Not surprised. You signed it? He asked. Yes, David replied tersely, finally facing him. Because that's what we do, Ethan. We keep momentum. We don't pause our lives over a woman from 10 years ago who vanished and reappeared with 2 kids that, let's be honest, might not even be yours. Ethan felt the words like a punch to the gut. He remained calm, but his jaw tightened. That woman is Lena. And those kids, those girls, they might be my daughters. David shook his head in frustration. Exactly. Might. And this all comes out of nowhere, just when we closed the biggest deal in the company's history. Ethan leaned back against his desk, arms crossed. You think it's a setup? David didn't answer immediately, but the narrowing of his eyes spoke volumes. I think you're not thinking clearly. You're a billionaire, Ethan, a visible one. People know your face, your company, your wealth. And now, conveniently, a former girlfriend shows up living on the street with 2 girls in tow. You really think the timing isn't suspect? Ethan's chest burned with defensiveness, but another voice inside, the one trained by years in high-stakes negotiation rooms, whispered the same question. He hated how plausible it sounded when someone else said it out loud. So, what do you suggest? Ethan asked quietly. David exhaled, calmer now. Protect yourself. If this is real, if they're really your daughters, then we'll handle it. But if it's not, you need to know now, not after it becomes a public relations disaster. You can't afford to be blindsided, Ethan. Not again. The conversation lingered long after David left the room. Ethan stood by the window, watching the city stretch and breathe below him. The rational part of him, the part that had built Carter Blake Capital from the ground up, knew David wasn't entirely wrong. The timing was odd, the circumstances were fragile. And yet, there was something in Ava's guarded smile, in Zoe's earnest questions, in Lena's hesitation that didn't feel manipulative. It felt real. But real or not, he needed answers. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Anderson Investigations, a clipped voice answered. This is Ethan Carter. I need discreet personal verification, background check, family connections, possible alias history. I'll have names and details sent over within the hour. I want everything. No leaks, no noise. Understand? The voice confirmed the job without hesitation. Ethan ended the call and immediately texted his attorney, start paperwork. Recognition of paternity contingent on DNA results. Quiet handling. Later that day, Ethan reviewed the preliminary forms his legal team sent over. A wave of discomfort passed through him as he scanned the language, contingent acknowledgement of potential minor offspring pending biological confirmation. The terminology was cold, clinical. It didn't match the warm chaos of the girls' laughter echoing in his mind or the way Lena's voice shook when she said, "No paper will teach you how to love them." Still, it was necessary. These were the systems his life had been built on, verifications, validations, signatures. He signed the documents quietly, then set them aside and stared at them for a long time. His name, his legacy, would either be formally tied to Ava and Zoe or not at all, and the thought of the latter outcome twisted something deep in his chest. As the sun dipped low over Manhattan, Ethan met David again in the private boardroom for a final discussion before the Mercer acquisition announcement. David, crisp and unflinching as always, briefed him on media strategy, shareholder updates, and the upcoming tech summit. But Ethan's focus wavered. You sent the investigator? David asked bluntly once the formalities ended. Ethan nodded. And the lawyer? David raised an eyebrow. Good. If this goes public, we need to control the story. The girl's existence, if confirmed, will impact everything, your image, the firm, even board confidence. Ethan bristled at the words. They're not a threat to the company, David. They're children, possibly mine. David's expression didn't soften. Exactly. That's why we need to control this. The moment you admit they're yours, everything changes: headlines, press, lawsuits, inheritance rights. You think Lena just wants a dinner and a family picnic? The question hit harder than expected. Ethan stood, his voice low. I don't know what Lena wants, but I know what I want. I want the truth. And if those girls are mine, then I'll deal with the fallout. I'll deal with the press, the board, the lawyers. But I won't walk away just because it's complicated. David sighed and nodded once, his tone neutral. Then let's make sure we're prepared for every outcome. As Ethan left the room, he realized something else. Even if the DNA said otherwise, even if none of this made sense legally or financially, the choice he was making was already clear. It wasn't about preparation anymore, it was about showing up, even if it broke everything he had built. That night, Ethan sat alone again, not in his office, but at the edge of his bed, flipping through the digital report sent by the investigator. Nothing alarming. Lena had no criminal history, no lawsuits, no red flags, just a long stretch of low-income employment, temporary shelters, medical clinic visits, and a handwritten note from a social worker describing her as resilient, private, and fiercely protective of her daughters. Ethan's eyes lingered on that last line. He imagined her sleeping on worn cots, skipping meals, shielding those girls from the worst of it with no help, no calls answered. The ghost of his own pride haunted him, the pride that had kept him too busy to take personal calls, the pride that once made him believe love was optional. Now it was pride he'd have to surrender to become something he never thought he'd be, a father. The days that followed were both a blur and sharply vivid for Ethan. Every morning brought new routines, unfamiliar, unpolished, and undeniably human. He started meeting Ava and Zoe at the park twice a week, sometimes picking them up from school with Lena's permission. The girls remained cautious, but the walls between them began to crack. Ava, ever watchful, started asking questions, some direct, some coded. Zoe was more fluid in her curiosity, tossing out questions between bites of ice cream or while dangling from the monkey bars. Ethan didn't always have answers, but he showed up consistently, patiently. As he laughed at Zoe's impressions of her favorite cartoon characters or helped Ava build elaborate leaf houses for squirrels, fragments of memory began to unearth themselves, some warm, others sharp as glass. He found himself asking the same question over and over, silently, almost obsessively: why didn't she tell me? That question became louder with each passing day. Ethan's memories of Lena weren't hazy. He remembered the intensity, the passion, the friction between their worlds. She was driven by creativity, emotional intelligence, and compassion. He, on the other hand, had measured everything by logic and efficiency. The ending hadn't been a dramatic explosion, it had been a slow, quiet suffocation. She had asked him to slow down, to look at her, to be present. He hadn't known how. Then one morning, she was gone. He hadn't chased her. He assumed she'd come back when she cooled off. When she didn't, he buried himself deeper in the firm, in global expansion, in victory after victory, none of which tasted quite like they should have. But now, with Ava's crooked smile and Zoe's stubborn insistence on fairness, those memories stung with new weight. Had Lena been pregnant when she left? Had she really walked away without telling him? Or had she tried? One sleepless night, long after the city's buzz faded into a distant hum outside his penthouse windows, Ethan sat at his desk with an old hard drive connected to his laptop. It had taken him hours to dig it out of the storage closet, an archive from his early years at Carter Blake Capital. It was encrypted, of course. His old assistant, Margaret, had insisted on locking everything down, citing security protocols. Ethan bypassed the protections now with a mix of ease and dread. Folder by folder, he browsed through press releases, tax forms, and old travel itineraries. Then he found it, a directory labeled Personal. Screened. It was full of emails, all flagged and marked unread. Dozens of them, some junk, some newsletters, but 3 from the same sender made his breath catch in his throat. Subject line, simple and plain, call me when you can. It's important, please. The sender, L. Brooks. Ethan opened the first message. It was dated 8 weeks after Lena had left. Her words were short, uncertain, almost embarrassed. I know you're busy, but I really need to talk. It's personal. Please. The second email was more direct. I wouldn't be reaching out if this wasn't important. I'm not asking for anything. Just 5 minutes of your time. The third was the one that gutted him. It read simply, I'm pregnant. That was it, no drama, no accusations, just a fact delivered into silence. Ethan leaned back in his chair, numb, his throat tightened. The dates matched exactly with Ava and Zoe's age. There had been no missed signals. He had simply never seen them because he had ordered Margaret to screen all personal messages during the firm's critical international expansion phase. No distractions, he had said, and Margaret had followed orders to the letter. She never even told him Lena had reached out. The guilt settled in his chest like wet cement. Ethan closed the laptop and buried his face in his hands. He hadn't just missed their birth, he had erased the possibility of knowing they existed, all because he had convinced himself that success required total sacrifice. In doing so, he had sacrificed the one thing that could never be replaced, time. Years of it, years of birthdays, skinned knees, first words, and bedtime stories, all gone. He wanted to blame Margaret, but he couldn't. The decision had been his, the priorities had been his, and now the consequences were his alone to carry. The girls were growing up without a father, not because Lena had kept them hidden, but because he had built walls too high for anyone to climb, even her. The next morning, Ethan sat in his car for over an hour outside Lena's apartment. He had no plan, he wasn't even sure if she'd want to see him, but he needed to say something, to admit that she had tried and he had failed. When she finally stepped outside, walking the girls toward school with their little backpacks bouncing behind them, Ethan got out of the car. The girls spotted him first. Zoe waved instantly, Ava hesitated, then offered a shy half-smile. Lena's eyes locked with his, guarded but not unkind. Hey, Ethan said softly as they approached. Can I walk with you? Lena looked down at the girls, who both nodded excitedly. She gave a hesitant nod. Sure, just until the gate. They walked in silence for a few moments, the noise of the city filling the space between their footsteps. Ethan kept glancing at Lena, his thoughts a cyclone of regret and apology. Finally, as they reached the school corner, he stopped. I found your emails, he said, his voice low. Lena froze. The air between them shifted instantly. You what? She asked carefully. From 10 years ago, he clarified. You sent 3. Margaret blocked them. I never saw them. I didn't know you were trying to reach me. I didn't know about the girls. Her face went pale. I thought you ignored me, she whispered. I thought you just didn't care. Ethan shook his head, guilt cutting through him like a blade. I did care. I just wasn't the kind of man back then who knew how to show it. And I was wrong about everything. Lena looked at him for a long moment, then down at Ava and Zoe, laughing near the school gate. You missed a lot, she said quietly. Ethan nodded, his eyes stinging. I know, but I'm here now. If you'll let me be. Lena didn't answer immediately, but her silence didn't feel like rejection. It felt like the air before a storm, charged with possibility. As the girls waved goodbye and ran inside, Ethan stood beside her, unmoving. Lena's voice came at last, soft but firm. This doesn't change everything, Ethan. It's not an apology that fixes the past. He nodded. I know. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for the chance to be present for what's left. She looked at him, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. Then start showing up, she said. Every day, not just when it's easy, not just when you feel guilty. Ethan took a slow breath. I will. And for the first time in a long time, he meant it without condition, without timeline, without needing control, just the simple truth of a man who had missed too much and didn't want to miss another moment. Ethan sat alone at his kitchen counter, the envelope resting in front of him like a verdict. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of his penthouse, golden and soft, but it did little to ease the weight pressing on his chest. He had stared at the envelope for nearly an hour, his coffee cold, untouched. The DNA results had arrived late the night before, hand-delivered by a private courier. Ethan hadn't opened it immediately, he hadn't been ready. This moment carried more weight than any boardroom acquisition or IPO launch. This wasn't just data, it was identity, legacy, truth. With a deep breath, he finally broke the seal, unfolded the crisp paper inside, and read the lines that would redefine everything: probability of paternity, 99.97%. His hands trembled. The page blurred as tears rose unbidden. The girls, Ava and Zoe, were his daughters. The confirmation didn't surprise him, but the finality of it struck him like a wave. He sat back, covering his face with both hands, and let the emotion come. For once, he didn't fight it, he didn't silence it with logic or distractions. He just let it crash over him, the joy, the grief, the regret, and the immense, humbling love. He cancelled 3 meetings that day without hesitation. His assistant, Jessica, didn't ask questions. She had learned over the past weeks that when Ethan said family, everything else paused. He dressed quickly, pulling on jeans and a navy hoodie, something casual enough for a park visit. As the car drove through the late morning bustle, Ethan stared out the window, rehearsing the words in his mind, "I'm your father." He'd imagined saying it before, but now that the moment had arrived, the weight of that truth settled on him like armor and responsibility all at once. Would they understand? Would they care? He had only just begun to scratch the surface of who they were. Ava with her guarded heart and precise questions, Zoe with her whirlwind energy and fierce curiosity. How would they react to something so enormous, so deeply personal? He didn't have answers, but this time, he wasn't letting uncertainty stop him. The car pulled up to Greenstone Park, and he spotted Lena sitting on a bench near the swings, the girls climbing the jungle gym nearby. As soon as they saw him, both girls lit up, Ava with a quiet, proud grin, Zoe with an enthusiastic wave and a shout of, "Hi, Ethan." It still twisted something in him when they used his name like that, not Dad, not Daddy, just Ethan. Today, that would change, or at least begin to. He walked toward them slowly, his heart pounding harder with each step. Lena stood to greet him, her eyes searching his face for answers. He didn't make her wait. He reached into his jacket and handed her the envelope, watching as she read it, her expression unreadable. When she looked up, her eyes were misty. "I didn't need a test to know," she said softly. "But thank you for doing it." Ethan nodded. "I needed to be sure, not because I doubted you, but because I didn't want there to be any doubt in the way I love them going forward." Lena smiled faintly, and for the first time, something shifted. She looked at him not with skepticism or exhaustion, but with the beginning of something warmer, respect, maybe even forgiveness. "So, what now?" she asked. Ethan turned to look at the girls playing just a few yards away. "Now, I tell them." He waited until the girls had climbed down and wandered closer, brushing leaves off their jackets and giggling about something only they understood. He knelt to their level, steadying his breath. "Can I talk to you both for a second?" he asked. Ava looked at him intently, always the more serious one. Zoe flopped onto the grass and nodded. "Sure." Ethan took a moment, then spoke, his voice quiet but certain. "I wanted to tell you something important, something I didn't know until recently." He looked into their eyes, identical, bright, full of life, and continued, "I'm your father, not just someone who visits or buys snacks. I'm really, truly your dad. The girls didn't respond right away. The silence was thick with processing. Ava looked at Lena, then back at Ethan. For real? She asked. For real, he confirmed. I didn't know when you were born. I didn't even know you existed. But now that I do, I'm never going away again. Ava's lips parted slightly, and then she launched forward, wrapping her arms around his neck with a quiet, intense grip. I knew it, she whispered. I knew you were someone. Zoe stayed seated for a moment, frowning thoughtfully, her fingers twisted in the edge of her sleeve, her eyes fixed on the grass. Does that mean we live with you now? She asked. Ethan blinked. Not right away, he said gently. You live with your mom, and that won't change unless we all agree. But it means I'll be around a lot, if that's okay. Zoe looked at Lena, then Ava, who was still hugging Ethan tightly. She didn't answer immediately. I don't remember having a dad, she said finally, her voice small. So, it's weird. Ethan nodded, respecting the honesty. That's fair, he said. You can take your time. We don't have to rush anything. Zoe's frown softened a bit, but she stayed where she was. Lena sat beside her, gently tucking a curl behind her ear. He's not trying to replace anything, sweetie. He's just trying to be part of your life now. Zoe thought for another long moment before she stood and approached slowly. Okay, she said. But you have to come to my next dance recital. Ethan smiled, his chest aching with relief. You got it. Lena watched the exchange in silence, her arms crossed tightly as if holding herself together. As the girls ran back to the slide, she stood beside Ethan and spoke in a quiet voice. I didn't expect you to say it like that. Ethan looked at her, eyebrows raised. Like what? She shrugged, a ghost of a smile on her lips. With so much care, so much patience. You were never that man before. He didn't take offense, he deserved that. I wasn't, he admitted. But I want to be now, for them. And, if it's not too late, for you to see that. Lena looked at him long and hard. One day at a time, she said. That's all I'll ever ask. Ethan nodded. I'll be there, every single one. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and motion. They played tag, fed ducks, and sat in the grass while the girls made daisy crowns with single-minded determination. Ethan didn't take any calls, he didn't check his email. For the first time in years, he didn't think about stock markets, venture capital, or what the headlines would say if people found out who those little girls really were. All he cared about was the sound of their voices, the warmth of the sun on their faces, and the promise he had made to be present, to be real, to be theirs. As the sun began to sink behind the trees, Ava reached up and slipped her hand into his again, just like she had days before. But this time, Ethan didn't see it as a question, he saw it as an answer. The call came just before noon. Ethan was in the middle of helping Zoe glue sequins onto her art project when his phone buzzed with David's name flashing across the screen. He almost didn't answer, it had been days since he'd allowed business to interrupt the new rhythm forming in his life. But something about the timing unsettled him. He stood, walking a few steps away from the girls, and pressed the phone to his ear. What is it? He asked, his voice low but firm. David didn't waste time. I thought you should know, Lena filed for full legal custody and substantial child support. It was submitted to the family court yesterday. Ethan froze, his stomach dropping as a wave of confusion and disbelief rushed through him. That's impossible, he said flatly. We've been building something together. We just told the girls I'm their father. David's voice was calm but clipped. I'm texting you the filings now. Our legal team pulled them from the system. You need to see it with your own eyes. The documents arrived moments later. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he opened them, skimming past the legal jargon until he found the details that mattered, Lena's name listed as petitioner, a request for sole custody of Ava and Zoe Mitchell, and an aggressive financial demand, more than anything Lena had ever hinted at. The signature at the bottom looked familiar but wrong, something about the pen stroke was too clean, too rehearsed. Ethan stood in stunned silence. It didn't make sense, none of it matched the woman he'd come to know over the past weeks, the woman who had refused his money, who only asked for consistency, for honesty, for presence. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was staring him in the face. Still, his instincts screamed louder than the paper in his hands. He grabbed his coat and keys, turned to Zoe and Ava. "I'll be right back," he said, kissing their foreheads. "I just need to clear something up." When he arrived at Lena's building, he didn't knock gently, his fist hit the door with more force than intended, adrenaline making his pulse race. Lena opened the door, wearing a look of immediate concern. "Ethan," she said, eyes wide. "Is something wrong with the girls?" He held up the stack of printed documents, his voice trembling with restrained emotion. "You want to explain this?" She took the papers, her eyes scanning the content. Her brow furrowed, and then confusion turned to disbelief. "What is this?" she asked, flipping the pages. "You don't know?" Ethan challenged, watching her reaction closely. "This was filed in your name. It says you want full custody. It says you want money." Lena's eyes widened. "I didn't file anything," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "I never signed these. This isn't even the address I used last year, this is 2 apartments ago." She pointed to the signature line. "That's not how I sign my name. Ethan, I swear to you, this isn't me." Silence fell between them, thick with tension and unraveling trust. Ethan stepped back, running both hands through his hair. "Then someone forged it," he muttered. "Someone with access to legal channels." Lena narrowed her eyes. "Who would do that?" she asked quietly. Ethan already knew the answer. "David," he said, almost spitting the name. "He's been warning me from the beginning, telling me not to get involved, to think about the company. He must have had his legal team fake the documents to protect me, to make sure I didn't give you too much leverage." Lena's mouth fell open. "Are you serious? That's criminal." Ethan nodded, slowly and strategic. "That's exactly how he operates." Her eyes darkened. "And you believed it, even for a second?" The pain in her voice was sharper than anger, it was betrayal. Ethan looked at her, defeated. "I didn't want to, but for a moment, I didn't know what to believe. It was written in ink. I was scared." Lena stepped back, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Scared of what?" "That loving them would cost you control. That I'd use them to ruin you." Ethan shook his head, his eyes burning. "Scared of losing them. Scared that I'd never really be part of their lives, that I'd be legally erased before I even had a chance." Lena's features softened slightly, but her voice remained guarded. "So, what now, Ethan? Do you still want to play dad when it might mean stepping away from your empire?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "If that's what it takes." Lena's breath caught. "You'd give up your company?" He nodded slowly. "I'd rather be broke and known as their father than rich and forgotten by them. I built that company from nothing, and I'll build again if I have to. But I won't walk away from them, not now, not after everything." Lena stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, not as the man she once loved or the businessman who let her disappear, but as someone who had finally chosen something bigger than himself. "You mean it," she said, barely a whisper. "Every word," he replied. Later that evening, Ethan called an emergency board meeting at Mitchell Carter Capital. He stood at the head of the table, composed but resolute. Effective immediately, he announced, David Blake is suspended pending an internal investigation into unauthorized legal filings. I am initiating a formal review. The room erupted with tension and questions, but Ethan remained firm. We don't sacrifice people for profit. Not anymore. This company was built on integrity, and I won't let it be corroded from the inside. His voice carried a finality that silenced the room. He was done being manipulated, done choosing fear over family, and most of all, done letting his daughters become pawns in someone else's game. By the time he returned to Lena's apartment, it was well past 9. The girls were asleep, their drawings still scattered across the coffee table. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching them with a tenderness that no boardroom could ever replicate. Lena joined him quietly, handing him a mug of tea. "So, what now?" she asked, not unkindly. Ethan took a sip, his gaze never leaving the sleeping girls. "Now," he said softly, "I start again, from here, with them." Lena didn't speak, but she didn't pull away when he reached for her hand. In that moment, something that had been broken between them began to mend, not with promises or apologies, but with presence, real, unwavering presence, the kind that said, "I am here, and I am not leaving." Ethan didn't announce his resignation to the press. There were no press releases, no strategic leaks to the business media, no farewell interviews or staged photos in front of Mitchell Carter Capital's headquarters. He simply walked into the Monday executive board meeting, handed over a sealed envelope to the interim chairman, and said, "It's time I stepped back." The room fell silent. For a man whose every move was analyzed by economists and analysts alike, the decision felt seismic. But Ethan wasn't looking for applause, he was looking for space, space to be the father he had never been allowed to be. After weeks of emotional chaos and legal revelations, the only thing that mattered now was presence. Being there, for real, for Ava, for Zoe, for Lena, too, in ways that didn't erase the past but helped them build something better. He officially appointed Julia Mendez, a trusted executive with years under her belt, as the new CEO. The board was stunned, but Ethan's tone made it clear, he wasn't asking for permission. He was giving his daughters a father, and that, for once, came first. The transition wasn't clean nor easy. His phone still rang non-stop the first few weeks, messages piling up with questions about transition protocols, long-term strategies, and market confidence. But each time he saw Ava's backpack lying near the front door or heard Zoe practicing her recital lines in the hallway, Ethan let the phone ring. He had traded power for presence, and it was worth it. He started small. The first morning, he drove the girls to school himself, no driver, no assistant. Zoe insisted on playing pop songs the entire ride, belting out the lyrics while Ava gave her disapproving glances and corrected the words. Ethan just laughed, absorbing every second. When they arrived, both girls turned to him before getting out of the car. "Will you pick us up, too?" Ava asked. "If you want me to," Ethan replied. Zoe grinned. "Yeah, we want." That was all the confirmation he needed. He watched them run through the school gate, backpacks bouncing, his chest aching with something that felt like healing. Lena noticed the difference immediately. It wasn't just the way Ethan started showing up, but the way he stayed. He didn't hover, he didn't try to control. Instead, he began to take part in the rhythm she had crafted for 6 years, mornings packed with mismatched socks and rushed lunches, nights of forgotten homework and tears over tangled hair. He helped without asking, he listened when the girls rambled. He even started cooking. His first attempt at pancakes was a disaster, Zoe called them burnt clouds, and refused to eat them, but by the third week, he had mastered breakfast burritos and a questionable but passable grilled cheese. Lena let him in slowly, cautiously. She had lived too long being both mother and father to let anyone take control again. But Ethan didn't want control anymore, he wanted belonging. It was during Zoe's first dance recital that Ethan truly understood what he had missed. The small auditorium was packed, buzzing with parents holding flowers and phones, waiting for their child's moment on stage. Ethan sat in the second row, a bouquet of sunflowers in his lap, heart pounding as if he were presenting a billion-dollar deal pitch. When Zoe stepped on stage, eyes wide under the lights, her gaze swept the room and locked on him. Her face broke into a grin so wide it made Ethan's throat tighten. She waved, breaking the choreography for a moment, but he didn't care. In that instant, nothing else in the world existed. After the performance, she ran to him backstage. "Did I do okay?" she asked, still catching her breath. Ethan knelt, holding out the flowers. "You were incredible," he said. "The best dancer on that stage." She blushed, her cheeks flushed with pride. Ava, ever the quiet supporter, handed her a bottle of water and whispered, "You didn't fall this time." They all laughed together. Doctor visits were another uncharted territory. Lena had always handled them, routine checkups, vaccinations, late-night fevers. Ethan had rarely even been informed, but now he was there, sitting beside Ava during her dental appointment, holding Zoe's hand during her flu shot. He learned the names of their pediatrician, the receptionist, and which cartoon bandages Zoe preferred. He kept track of appointments in his own calendar, not his assistant's. Lena began to send him reminders less often, not because she didn't care, but because she realized she didn't have to anymore. He was present, genuinely, not out of obligation or guilt, but because he wanted to be. The girls noticed. Ava started drawing pictures that included him, stick-figure families that now had 4 people instead of 3. Zoe asked if he could attend the school's "Donuts with Dads" event, then whispered, "You don't have to eat the donut, just come." And he did. The hardest part came late one night when Ava couldn't sleep. She knocked gently on Ethan's door in the guest room he now occupied at Lena's place whenever he stayed late. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. He sat up, motioning for her to come in. "Of course." She crawled onto the edge of the bed, pulling her knees up. "Do you think you'll ever leave again?" The question was soft, but it pierced deeper than any business negotiation ever had. Ethan reached for her hand. "No," he said. "I missed too much already. I can't change the past, but I promise I'm not going anywhere now." She looked at him, searching for cracks in the words. "Even if we get boring?" she asked. He smiled. "Especially then. I want to be there for the boring stuff, too." She nodded and leaned her head against his arm. "Okay, I believe you." That night, Ethan didn't sleep much, but not from anxiety. He was awake because his heart was full, because he had finally found something more valuable than everything he'd once thought mattered. Weeks turned into months. Ethan's new role as board advisor gave him enough space to remain connected to Mitchell Carter Capital while allowing him to focus on his daughters and the fragile trust he was rebuilding with Lena. They shared parenting decisions now, school choices, vacation planning, discipline. They disagreed sometimes, but with respect. Ethan learned that co-parenting was as much about showing up for each other as it was for the children. The girls flourished in the new stability. Ava became more expressive, writing small stories about a girl and her scientist dad. Zoe's confidence soared. She declared herself president of their apartment and made Ethan sign a made-up family contract, which he framed and hung in his home office. On it, written in rainbow marker, "Daddy promises to listen, hug a lot, and never miss a bedtime story." It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward silences and unresolved pieces between him and Lena. But something unspoken was slowly blooming, like forgiveness, maybe even the beginning of something deeper. And in the quiet moments, when the house was finally still and the girls were asleep, Ethan would look around at the chaos of their toys, the half-finished puzzles, the color drawings taped to the fridge, and know with absolute clarity, this was the best decision he had ever made. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't building a legacy through profits or expansion, he was building it through love, through presence, through fatherhood. 6 months had passed since Ethan Carter stepped down as CEO. And yet, if someone had asked him to explain what had changed, he wouldn't know where to begin. The boardrooms, financial forecasts, and prestige that once defined his every waking moment had faded into the background. In their place were school runs, art projects taped crookedly to his fridge, bedtime stories read with soft voices, and dinners filled with overlapping chatter about science fairs, recess drama, and Zoe's latest obsession with space. Ava had grown more confident, her quiet nature blooming into eloquence. Zoe, forever energetic, had become more centered, knowing that the people she loved weren't going anywhere. As for Lena, the transformation in her life had been just as profound. With a new job at a prestigious interior design firm, thanks to a recommendation from Ethan that came without strings attached, she had regained her professional identity, and with it, her confidence. Watching her re-enter the workforce with grace and fire made Ethan feel something he hadn't expected: pride, not for what he'd done, but for who she was becoming again. The new normal between them had settled into something fluid and respectful. They shared custody seamlessly, with weekends blending naturally and weekday routines divided by need rather than obligation. Their communication had become effortless, built on trust that was slowly mended and maintained with quiet consistency. Ethan never overstepped, Lena never withheld. They were partners, not romantically, but in the truest sense of the word, unified in purpose, bound by the two souls they had created together. The girls thrived in the stability. Their teachers noticed it first. Zoe's focus sharpened, Ava's participation in class increased. Ethan attended every parent-teacher conference with Lena, no longer awkward in the fluorescent-lit classrooms, no longer a stranger to his daughter's world. He even started helping with school projects, once crafting a model volcano with Zoe that erupted mid-presentation, covering a third of the classroom in dyed vinegar foam. The teacher laughed, so did the kids. Ethan, mortified but proud, took full responsibility. Zoe, of course, took full credit. As the twins' 7th birthday approached, Lena suggested a backyard celebration at the new duplex she had moved into with the girls. The house, small but bright, was decorated with warm tones, vintage furniture, and Lena's signature touches: exposed wood, bursts of color, and photographs in every corner. The girls wanted a galaxy theme, complete with star-shaped cookies, space-themed games, and a cake shaped like Saturn. Ethan didn't just agree, he dove in. He ordered decorations from 3 different suppliers, hired a magician dressed like an astronaut, and spent an entire afternoon learning how to make glittery moon-shaped balloons. On the day of the party, the backyard buzzed with laughter and music. Kids from school filled the grass, parents sipped lemonade, and the twins darted between games, shouting orders and squealing with joy. It was, by all accounts, chaotic perfection. Then, halfway through the party, David Blake appeared. Ethan spotted him at the gate, holding a large, awkwardly wrapped gift, looking entirely out of place in a tailored gray blazer. For a moment, Ethan didn't move. The history between them, recent wounds, unspoken apologies, hung heavy in the air. But then Ava noticed. "Daddy, someone's here," she called. Zoe followed her gaze and frowned, then whispered something to her sister. Lena stood nearby, her body tense. Ethan took a breath and walked toward David. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice even. David cleared his throat. "I didn't expect to come, but I figured 7-year-old forgiveness might be easier to earn than yours." He held out the gift. "It's a telescope. Thought it might suit your future astronaut." Ethan looked at the package, then at David. There was something genuine in his expression, awkward, yes, but sincere. Ethan nodded once and took the gift. "Thanks. She'll love it." The girls welcomed David with cautious curiosity. Zoe asked 3 questions in rapid fire. "Do you know any real astronauts? Do you eat cake? Why is your hair so perfect?" While Ava watched from a distance before finally offering him a balloon and declaring, "You're weird, but you can stay." David laughed, visibly touched. He ended up staying for over an hour, watching the girls, chatting briefly with Lena, and even joining a game of trivia led by the magician. Ethan watched the scene unfold with a strange sense of peace. A year ago, this kind of gathering would have made him itch for an exit, some reason to return to work. Now, he lingered. He took photos, passed out cake, and even danced badly with Zoe in the middle of the lawn to a Taylor Swift song blaring from someone's speaker. Ava pretended to be embarrassed but smiled through it all. As the sun dipped low and the guests began to leave, Ethan found himself seated on the back steps of the porch, watching Ava and Zoe chase bubbles through the golden light. Lena joined him, 2 slices of cake in hand. "Not bad for your first joint birthday party," she said, offering him a plate. He took it with a nod, smiling. "I still can't believe David showed up," he said. Lena shrugged. "People change." Ethan looked at her. "Some more than others." She smiled faintly, but her eyes lingered on the girls. "They're happy," she said softly. "That's all that matters." Ethan followed her gaze. "They are, and for the first time, I think I am, too." Lena glanced at him, surprised. "You, happy without board meetings and 20 calls a day?" He chuckled. "Who knew?" The laughter between them faded into a quiet comfort, a shared silence that didn't need filling. As night fell and the last of the cake was eaten, Ava climbed onto Ethan's lap and leaned against his chest. "Best birthday ever," she mumbled sleepily. Zoe flopped down beside them, frosting still on her cheek. Ethan wrapped his arms around them both and looked up at the stars beginning to blink in the sky. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. There were still old wounds to heal, still challenges to face. But in that moment, surrounded by laughter, memories, and the family he never expected to have, Ethan knew he had never been more complete, not as a CEO, not as a public figure, but as a father, and finally, as a man who chose presence over power and never looked back. The private jet cut through the clouds over the English Channel, a sleek silver arrow bound for Geneva. Inside, Ethan sat stiffly, laptop open but untouched. Charts, contracts, and legal briefs blinked across the screen, forgotten. The conference room meeting in Zurich had ended just an hour ago. It was successful, more than that, it was historic. The European merger with Lonterra Financial would not only triple Mitchell Carter Capital's global reach but redefine the firm's presence in the European tech infrastructure space. Everyone was celebrating, everyone except Ethan. Because as he sat in the leather seat, his mind wasn't in Geneva, Zurich, or anywhere above Europe. It was back in Brooklyn, in a school auditorium filled with folding chairs, painted cardboard props, and 2 little girls who had rehearsed their lines for weeks. Tonight was Zoe's school play, her first time on stage, and Ava, normally calm and unshakable, had called him 2 nights ago, whispering over the phone, "I don't like sleeping without you here, Daddy. Please be home soon." The call had shaken him more than any hostile boardroom confrontation ever had. Ethan tried to focus on the conversation replaying in his head, his CFO urging him to extend his stay in Europe to show strength and leadership, to make one last appearance that would signal full executive alignment. "You've built this deal for months," they had said. "You can't pull out now. One day won't kill you." But Ethan knew better. One day could kill something. Trust, momentum, belonging. He closed the laptop, leaned back, and stared out at the darkening sky. For years, he had taught himself to believe that leadership meant presence at the top. Now he knew the truth, it meant presence where it mattered most. And tonight, it mattered in a room with Ava and Zoe, where tiny voices were waiting to find his eyes in a crowd and smile with recognition. His assistant's voice chimed in through the cabin intercom, asking whether to confirm the next day's investor breakfast. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Turn the jet around," he said. "We're going home." The flight back to New York was a race against time. Every moment felt heavier as Ethan refreshed the clock on his phone, calculating whether he'd make it before the curtain rose. The jet landed at Teterboro Airport with just over an hour to spare. His driver, already waiting, took one look at Ethan's face and floored it. Traffic was heavy, and the Manhattan skyline glowed with the early evening lights, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind was already there, in that auditorium, in that front row seat he had promised to occupy weeks ago. When they finally pulled up in front of the school, Ethan didn't wait for the door to be opened. He sprinted across the parking lot, ignoring the confused stares of parents and late arrivals. The muffled sound of music drifted through the gymnasium doors. He slipped in just as the lights dimmed. A volunteer handed him a program, but he barely looked at it. His eyes scanned the rows until he saw them, Lena in the center aisle, an empty seat beside her, and two tiny heads peeking over the curtain edge backstage. Zoe's class was the second act. Ethan sat frozen in his chair, heart pounding louder than the music. He hadn't been this nervous since his very first shareholders' meeting, but this meant infinitely more. Lena leaned over and whispered, "They kept asking if you'd come. I didn't promise anything, but I told them you'd try." Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the stage. And then it happened. The curtain lifted. Zoe stepped into the spotlight, wearing a mismatched animal costume and the biggest smile he had ever seen. She delivered her first line with confidence, but then, midway through a sentence, her gaze drifted to the audience. She scanned, searching, pausing, and then she saw him. Her eyes lit up, her voice caught with a tiny gasp. "Daddy, we saw you," she called out, unscripted, unfiltered, and full of joy. Laughter rippled through the audience. Ethan's vision blurred as he waved back, heart bursting in his chest. Ava, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans for her small role as a narrator, caught his eye. She didn't wave, she didn't break character, but her smile widened, slow and proud, and she gave the smallest of nods, one of recognition, of security. It said more than words ever could, "You made it." Ethan sat back in the creaky metal chair, letting the moment wash over him. Everything he had once believed about success, status, and power unraveled. This wasn't about appearances, this wasn't about control. This was about belonging, about showing up, about choosing them again and again, even when it cost something, especially then. After the show, chaos reigned in the cafeteria, where parents snapped photos and kids rushed around with frosting-stained cupcakes. Zoe burst into Ethan's arms before he could even stand. "I saw you. You were really there," she exclaimed, her costume half unzipped and her face lit up like 1,000 suns. Ethan lifted her into his arms. "Of course I was there," he said. "You think I'd miss your big debut?" Ava hugged him from the side, quieter but with no less intensity. "I was afraid you'd be late," she said. "I almost was," he admitted. "But I made a choice." Lena approached, her coat draped over one arm, her eyes reflecting something deep, pride, relief, and something softer. "A very different Ethan would have stayed in Geneva," she murmured. Ethan smiled, still holding both girls. "That Ethan doesn't exist anymore." Later that night, as he tucked Ava and Zoe into bed, the house silent except for the occasional creak of radiators and city wind, Ethan sat on the edge of their bed and watched them breathe, their bodies soft with sleep and their arms curled protectively under their chins. He thought about Zurich, about mergers and balance sheets, about the countless planes, meetings, and hotel rooms that had once seemed like accomplishments but now felt like absences. Then he looked around the room, drawings on the walls, stuffed animals piled high, and two sleeping girls who had changed everything. He kissed their foreheads one by one and whispered, "You're my everything now." Down the hall, Lena waited with 2 mugs of tea, one already steeping. She smiled when he entered, and they sat quietly at the kitchen table, letting the peace of the moment settle between them. "You didn't have to come back," she said after a while. "The old you wouldn't have." Ethan nodded. "I know, but the old me didn't know what it meant to be needed, not like this." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Whatever comes next, whatever choices I have to make, this is the one I'll keep choosing, over and over again." Lena didn't say anything for a moment. Then she turned her palm up and laced her fingers with his. And as the city hummed around them, Ethan Carter realized that the future wasn't a boardroom or a title, it wasn't measured in revenue or reach. The future was 2 girls asleep down the hallway, a woman who had once walked away and now sat beside him, and a quiet kitchen filled with tea and second chances. It was imperfect, it was unpredictable. But finally, it was home, and it had a name, family. Did this story move you? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear what touched your heart the most. Here at Levi Stories, we create each video with care and dedication, thinking of you and the emotions these stories can bring. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support truly helps us keep sharing meaningful stories like this. And if you're ready for more heartfelt moments, take a look at the other videos we've prepared with the same love. Thank you for being part of the Levi Stories family.